the mysterious friend from Miss Marple's youth. Welcome to Cafe Tales. I'm Ailey, your host, and I'm so glad to have you with us again tonight. I have a new question for you. Do you enjoy looking back on your youth? And what was that time like for you? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for new mysteries every day. Now let's unravel tonight's story together. Chapter 1. A Face from 1902. The afternoon sun filtered through the chintz curtains of Miss Jane Marple's sitting room, casting gentle shadows across the worn Persian carpet that had seen better days, but retained its dignity nonetheless. Miss Marple sat in her favorite chair by the window, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on what appeared to be a particularly intricate pattern in soft blue wool. "More tea, Jane?" Lady Bantry inquired, lifting the delicate silver teapot with its hand-painted roses. Dolly Bantry had arrived precisely at 3:30, as was her custom on Wednesdays, bringing with her the latest village gossip and an insatiable appetite for Miss Marple's homemade seed cake. "Thank you, dear," Miss Marple replied, setting down her knitting with care. "Though I do hope Mrs. Jameson's cat finds its way home soon. Such a worry for her, and at her age, too." Lady Bantry was about to launch into a detailed account of the various theories surrounding the missing tabby when the brass knocker on the front door sounded with 3 deliberate raps. Both ladies paused, their teacups halfway to their lips. "How odd," murmured Miss Marple, glancing at the mantel clock. "I'm not expecting anyone at this hour." The sound of Mrs. Jameson's footsteps could be heard in the hallway, followed by muffled conversation. A moment later, the sitting room door opened to reveal a woman of perhaps 60 years, impeccably dressed in a navy traveling costume with matching hat. She clutched a small Victorian photograph album against her chest as though it contained the crown jewels. "Miss Marple." The woman's voice carried a slight tremor of emotion. "Oh, my dear Jane, is it really you after all these years?" Miss Marple rose gracefully from her chair, her pale blue eyes studying the visitor with that peculiar intensity that had served her so well in matters of human nature. "I'm afraid you have the advantage of me," she said gently, "though your face does seem somehow familiar." The woman stepped forward, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Of course, it has been such a terribly long time. I am Mrs. Isabel Vale now, though you would have known me as Lavinia Hart. We were such great friends in Sunday school. Don't you remember? Before I went up to London to live with my aunt. Lavinia Hart," Miss Marple repeated slowly, as if tasting the name. "Why, of course, though goodness me, it must be over 50 years. Lady Bantry, never one to be left out of an interesting encounter, cleared her throat expectantly. Miss Marple performed the necessary introductions, and soon Mrs. Vale was seated in the third chair with a cup of tea balanced on her knee, and the mysterious album resting beside her. "I do hope you'll forgive my appearing like this without warning," Mrs. Vale said, dabbing at her eyes with a lace-edged handkerchief. "But when I heard from Mrs. Trent at the post office that you were still living here in St. Mary, Mead, exactly where you always were, I simply couldn't resist calling upon you." She opened the album with reverent care, revealing sepia-toned photographs mounted on thick card pages. "I've treasured these memories all these years. Look here," she said, indicating a group photograph of children arranged on the vicarage lawn. "The parish picnic of 1902. There you are in your lovely blue sash, and there am I beside you." Miss Marple accepted the album and studied the photograph through her glasses. Indeed, there was a young Jane Marple, perhaps 14 years old, standing next to a girl labeled in pencil as Le. The writing appeared somewhat fresh against the foxed edges of the old photograph. "You remember the curate's bicycle?" "Surely," Mrs. Vale continued with growing animation. "How he would ride it up and down the lane, quite scandalizing Mrs. Weatherby. And the swing behind the vicarage where we spent so many happy afternoons." "Oh, yes," Miss Marple murmured thoughtfully. "The swing, such pleasant memories." Mrs. Vale leaned forward confidently. I wonder, Jane dear, if you might be free this evening. The Women's Institute is having rather an interesting demonstration, and Mrs. Mallow, who has quite a reputation as an herbalist, is going to show us how to prepare a bay leaf steam treatment for tired complexions. Such a delightfully old-fashioned remedy, don't you think? I thought it might amuse you. Lady Bantry raised an eyebrow. Bay steam. How perfectly Victorian. Oh, but wonderfully effective, I'm told, Mrs. Vale insisted. Mrs. Mallow swears by it. A few leaves in hot water, a towel over one's head, and 5 minutes of breathing the aromatic vapors. She says it works absolute wonders for the skin. Miss Marple continued to study the photograph, noting the careful composition and the way the light fell across the children's faces. Something about it troubled her, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what. I should be delighted to attend, she said finally, closing the album and returning it to Mrs. Vale. It's been far too long since I participated in a WI meeting. Mrs. Vale's face lit up with genuine pleasure. Oh, how wonderful! It begins at 7 sharp in the parish hall. Mrs. Mallow is most particular about punctuality. She rose to leave, smoothing her skirts. I simply cannot tell you how happy this makes me, Jane. To think that after all these years we should meet again in the very place where we spent our childhood. After Mrs. Vale had departed, Lady Bantry turned to Miss Marple with barely concealed curiosity. Well, Jane, how perfectly extraordinary. Did you truly remember her? Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles moving with mechanical precision. Memories can be such tricky things, Dolly. Sometimes what we remember isn't quite what actually happened. Whatever do you mean? Oh, nothing really. It's just that Mrs. Vale seems to remember details with remarkable clarity for events that occurred over half a century ago. The blue sash, for instance, and the curate's bicycle. Such specific things. Lady Bantry helped herself to another slice of seed cake. Perhaps she has simply treasured those memories all these years. Perhaps, Miss Marple agreed, though her tone suggested she was not entirely convinced. She held her knitting up to the light, examining her stitches with the same careful attention she had given to the photograph. Though I do find myself wondering about that photograph album. The mounting corners looked remarkably fresh for something supposedly kept for 50 years. You don't think she's really Lavinia Hart? Miss Marple smiled, that gentle, knowing smile that her friends recognized as a sign that her remarkably acute mind was already at work on some puzzle. I think, my dear Dolly, that this evening's demonstration may prove more interesting than a simple beauty treatment with bay leaves. As Lady Bantry prepared to leave, she paused at the door. You will be careful, won't you, Jane? There was something about that woman I didn't quite like. Too eager, perhaps? Miss Marple nodded absently, her attention already focused on the evening ahead. Through her sitting-room window, she could see the spire of the parish church rising above the ancient yew trees, and beyond it the modest building that served as the village hall. Whatever Mrs. Isabel Vale's true purpose in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had the distinct feeling that all would be revealed before the night was through. Chapter 2. Schoolroom. Memories and a Tear. The parish hall of St. Mary Mead had seen countless gatherings over the decades, from harvest festivals to amateur theatrical productions. But this evening it buzzed with a particular feminine excitement. The Women's Institute had transformed the normally austere space with cheerful arrangements of summer flowers, and the familiar scent of lavender polish mingled with the anticipation of the assembled ladies. Miss Marple arrived punctually at 7 cow, her best black silk dress complemented by a modest string of pearls that had belonged to her mother. She surveyed the scene with her characteristic quiet observation, noting the careful arrangements and the eager faces of her fellow villagers. Jane, my dear, you did come. Mrs. Vale appeared at her elbow almost immediately, resplendent in an evening dress of deep plum silk that spoke of London shops rather than village seamstresses. I was so hoping you wouldn't change your mind. At the far end of the hall, Mrs. Mallow was arranging her demonstration materials with the methodical precision of a woman accustomed to exact measurements. An enamel jug sat ready beside a small Primus stove, while neat rows of towels waited to serve as makeshift tents for the beauty treatment. Lady Bantry, who had arrived despite her earlier skepticism, made her way through the small crowd to join Miss Marple. I must admit, Jane, I'm rather curious to see how this ancient beauty remedy works, though I suspect my complexion is beyond the help of mere herbs at this stage. Mrs. Vale laughed, a tinkling sound that seemed almost rehearsed. Oh, but Mrs. Mallow swears by the restorative properties of bay leaves. She's been practicing herbal treatments for 30 years, haven't you, Mrs. Mallow? The herbalist looked up from her preparations, a sturdy woman in her 50s with the practical air of someone who dealt in tangible remedies rather than fashionable nonsense. I suppose so, she said, though I've never seen such enthusiasm for a simple steam treatment. Bay leaves are beneficial, certainly, but they're hardly a fountain of youth. As the ladies settled into their chairs, Mrs. Vale regaled them with tales of her London years, weaving stories of society parties and cultural events with the practiced ease of an accomplished raconteur. Yet Miss Marple found herself more interested in watching the woman's hands as she spoke. Neat, well-manicured hands that bore the telltale signs of recent outdoor work in the form of a faint greenish smudge along the right thumb. Do you remember, Jane? Mrs. Vale continued, her voice taking on a wistful quality. How we used to practice our letters in the old schoolroom. Miss Henderson was so particular about our penmanship. She would make us copy out Bible verses until our fingers ached. Miss Henderson? Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. I'm afraid my memory isn't quite what it was. Was she the teacher before Miss Crabtree or after? A fleeting look of uncertainty crossed Mrs. Vale's features before she smiled broadly. Oh, before, certainly. Thought they were both such strict disciplinarians, weren't they? Always insisting on proper deportment and careful speech. Through the open door of the hall, the sound of footsteps on gravel announced the arrival of young Tommy Byle, the church gardener's boy, carrying a large trug filled with what appeared to be freshly cut greenery. He paused in the doorway, breathing heavily from his exertions. Begging your pardon, ladies, he called out cheerfully. Just finished pruning the churchyard hedge. Lovely evening for it, though the laurel was growing something fierce around the old monuments. Several of the ladies laughed at this interruption, and Mrs. Vale seemed particularly amused. How wonderfully rustic, she observed to Lady Bantry. I'd quite forgotten how charming village life could be. As Tommy disappeared into the gathering dusk, Mrs. Vale's demeanor shifted subtly. She leaned closer to Miss Marple and Lady Bantry, her voice dropping to a confidential whisper. I do hope you won't think me presumptuous, Jane, but I've brought certain papers with me, documents that I've kept safe all these years. They concern matters that were, well, let us say they were handled with discretion in our youth, as was proper. But there are those who should know the truth, particularly now that so many of the principals have passed on. Lady Bantry's eyebrows rose with interest. How intriguing. What sort of matters? Mrs. Vale glanced around the hall as if checking for eavesdroppers. Family matters, you understand. Questions of legitimacy that were glossed over to protect reputations. I have a sealed envelope in my handbag. Papers that could set a great wrong right, if only the right person behaves with proper discretion. Miss Marple's knitting needles stilled in her lap as she absorbed this revelation. And you believe I am that right person? Oh yes, dear Jane. Your reputation for wisdom and discretion is quite legendary, even in London circles. I know I can trust you to handle such delicate matters appropriately. Before Miss Marple could respond, Mrs. Mallow called for attention from the front of the hall. The Primus stove had been lit, and the enamel jug was beginning to steam gently. Ladies, if you would gather round, I'll demonstrate the proper method for preparing a bay leaf steam. It's quite simple, really, but there are certain precautions one must observe. The assembled women clustered around the demonstration area, chattering excitedly about the promised benefits of the treatment. Mrs. Vale positioned herself at the front of the group, her eyes bright with anticipation. Now then, Mrs. Mallow continued, holding up a paper sachet, I've brought genuine culinary bay leaves, dried of course, and broken into pieces for better release of the beneficial oils. Just a small amount in hot water, mind you. Too much can be overwhelming to the senses. She poured the contents of the sachet into the steaming jug, and the air filled with the distinctive aroma of bay leaves. A clean white towel was arranged to form a tent over the jug, held in place by what appeared to be a length of fine wire. The treatment involves breathing the steam for approximately 5 minutes, Mrs. Mallow explained. It should be gentle and pleasant, never harsh or uncomfortable. Who would like to be the first to try it? Oh, I simply must, Mrs. Vale exclaimed, stepping forward eagerly. I've been so looking forward to this all day. It reminds me of the herbal treatments my dear aunt used to prepare when I was recovering from illness in London. As she settled herself into position before the steaming jug, Miss Marple found herself studying the arrangement with unexpected intensity. There was something about the setup that struck her as not quite right, though she couldn't immediately identify what it was. Mrs. Vale positioned the towel tent over her head and began to breathe deeply of the aromatic steam. For a moment all seemed perfectly normal. The gentle hiss of the Primus stove, the soft murmur of conversation among the ladies, the evening light fading through the tall windows of the hall. Then Mrs. Vale's breathing changed, becoming rapid and shallow. She swayed slightly in her chair, one hand clutching at the edge of the table for support. I feel rather, she began, her voice weak and confused. Something's not quite. Before anyone could react, Mrs. Isabel Vale pitched forward and collapsed to the floor, the towel falling away from the still steaming jug. In the sudden, shocked silence that followed, Miss Marple detected something that made her blood run cold. Not the wholesome scent of bay leaves, but the distinctive bitter odor of almonds, hanging in the evening air. Chapter 3. Miss Marple notices Almond the parish hall, erupted into controlled chaos, that peculiar blend of feminine efficiency and barely restrained panic that emerges when disaster strikes a village. Gathering, Mrs. Clement immediately took charge, directing 2 of the younger women to support Mrs. Vale, while Lady Bantry hurried to the telephone to summon Dr. Haydock. Give her air, ladies. Give her air, commanded Mrs. Clement, though her voice betrayed the tremor of someone who had never actually dealt with a medical emergency beyond applying sticking plasters to scraped knees. Miss Marple remained seated, her keen eyes taking in every detail of the scene with the methodical precision of a naturalist observing specimens, while the other ladies fluttered about with smelling salts and anxious suggestions. She noted the peculiar stillness that had settled over Mrs. Vale's features, the waxy pallor that spoke of something far more serious than a simple fainting spell. Perhaps we should move her to the sofa in the vestibule, suggested Miss Weatherby, wringing her hands. She might be more comfortable there. Best not to move her just yet, Miss Marple said quietly, rising from her chair with deliberate slowness. Dr. Haydock will want to see her exactly as she fell. The wisdom of this observation was lost in the general confusion, but Lady Bantry, returning from the telephone, caught Miss Marple's meaningful glance and nodded almost imperceptibly. The 2 women had known each other long enough to communicate without words in situations requiring delicacy. Dr. Haydock arrived within 10 minutes, his medical bag in one hand and his coat still unbuttoned from the haste of his journey. He was a man in his 60s, gruff but competent, who had served the village through countless crises, both great and small. One look at Mrs. Vale's motionless form was sufficient for his experienced eye. "I'm afraid there's nothing to be done," he announced after a brief examination, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "Her heart, most likely. These sudden attacks are not uncommon in women of her age, particularly those unaccustomed to excitement or exertion." Inspector Slack arrived shortly thereafter, summoned by protocol rather than suspicion. He was a thin, nervous man who approached even routine matters with an air of barely contained irritation, as if the world conspired to inconvenience him personally. "Natural causes, then, Doctor?" he inquired, pulling out his notebook with the resigned air of a man fulfilling tedious obligations. "All the signs point to cardiac failure," Dr. Haydock confirmed. "Though I'll need to conduct a proper examination, of course. Still, these herbal steam treatments can be quite overwhelming for someone with a weak constitution." During this official exchange, Miss Marple had positioned herself near the demonstration table, apparently gathering up scattered programs and straightening chairs in that unobtrusive way that made her presence seem entirely natural. The Primus stove still hissed quietly, and the enamel jug continued to emit its gentle steam, though the towel tent had been abandoned in the confusion. "Such a tragedy," murmured Mrs. Mallow, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "And to think it was my demonstration that brought it on. I shall never forgive myself." "Nonsense, my dear," Lady Bantry assured her. "You could hardly have predicted such a thing. Your bay leaf treatment has been used safely for generations." Miss Marple paused in her tidying, her nose wrinkling slightly, as if detecting something unpleasant. The general commotion had stirred the air considerably, and the evening breeze from the open door was beginning to dissipate the various scents that lingered in the hall. Yet there was something underneath the expected aromas, something that didn't quite belong. Moving with the careful deliberation of age, she approached the abandoned steaming apparatus. The towel lay crumpled beside the table where it had fallen when Mrs. Vale collapsed. Miss Marple bent slightly, as if to retrieve it, and lifted one corner to her nose. The scent that met her nostrils was decidedly not the wholesome fragrance of culinary herbs. Instead, there was a bitter, almost medicinal quality to the vapor, the unmistakable odor of bitter almonds that any country-bred woman would recognize from the preparation of certain traditional remedies. "Inspector Slack," she called softly, her voice carrying just enough authority to cut through the general conversation. "I wonder if you might spare a moment." Slack approached with the weary expression of a man who had learned to be cautious around Miss Marple's observations. Their previous encounters had taught him that her seemingly innocent remarks often led to complications he preferred to avoid. "Yes, Miss Marple? Something troubling you about this unfortunate accident?" "Oh, I wouldn't presume to question Dr. Haydock's professional judgment," she replied with that gentle deference that somehow managed to sound more alarming than direct contradiction. "It's merely that the steam seems rather unusual." She gestured toward the enamel jug, which continued to emit its feeble vapor. The Primus flame had burned lower, and the contents were barely warm enough to produce any visible steam at all. "How do you mean, unusual?" Miss Marple lifted the edge of the towel again, inviting him to examine the apparatus more closely. "The scent, Inspector. Mrs. Mallow used dried bay leaves from her shop, quite proper culinary herbs. But this—" She inhaled delicately and stepped back. "This smells rather strongly of bitter almonds." Slack frowned and leaned closer to the jug, his expression shifting from irritation to puzzlement. The bitter scent was indeed noticeable once attention was drawn to it, though it was fading rapidly in the moving air. "That is odd," he admitted reluctantly. "Mrs. Mallow, what exactly did you put in this jug?" The herbalist hurried over, her face creased with worry. "Nothing but dried bay leaves from my own stock, Inspector. I brought them in a paper sachet." Here you can see, she produced the empty packet, which bore her shop's neat label and contained only a few fragments of the characteristic dull matte leaves of Laurus nobilis and Miss Marple peered into the still steaming jug with the curiosity of a woman examining a particularly interesting piece of needlework. Floating in the hot water were indeed leaves, but they were nothing like the broken papery fragments in Mrs. Mallow's sachet. These were fresh, glossy, and distinctly serrated along their edges. "How very curious," she murmured, fishing one of the leaves from the water with the tip of her knitting needle. She held it up to the light, noting its thick, waxy texture and the way it gleamed with natural oils. When she rubbed it gently between her fingers, the bitter almond scent intensified noticeably. "That's not bay at all," Mrs. Mallow declared with the authority of professional expertise. "That's cherry laurel, Prunus lauricericis. Quite a different plant entirely, though I suppose someone unfamiliar with herbs might confuse them." Inspector Slack's expression had shifted from mere puzzlement to something approaching genuine concern. "And cherry laurel would be poisonous," Miss Marple said quietly, her voice cutting through the sudden silence that had fallen over their small group. "Quite dangerously so. When the leaves are crushed or heated, they release prussic acid, hydrogen cyanide, to be precise." The implications of this revelation settled over the gathering like a dark cloud. Dr. Haydock, who had been preparing to leave, returned to examine the contents of the jug with new interest, his professional manner taking on a grim intensity. "Good Lord," he muttered, studying the telltale leaves. If Mrs. Vale inhaled concentrated fumes from cherry laurel, that would certainly explain the sudden collapse and the apparent cardiac symptoms. Miss Marple moved quietly to the hall's main door and closed it firmly against the evening breeze. Already the incriminating scent was nearly gone, dispersed by the moving air. In another few minutes there would have been no trace of the bitter almonds to suggest anything amiss with Mrs. Mallow's innocent demonstration. "The question now," she said, with that deceptive mildness that her friends had learned to recognize as a sign of deep thought, "is how cherry laurel leaves came to be substituted for Mrs. Mallow's perfectly harmless bay leaves. Such a substitution would require both knowledge and opportunity, and I rather fear deliberate intent." Inspector Slack looked around the hall with new eyes, seeing not a gathering of village ladies pursuing beauty treatments, but a potential crime scene where someone had committed murder with botanical precision. Chapter 4: Leaves in the Jug. The transformation of the parish hall, from a scene of feminine social gathering to one of criminal investigation, proceeded with that peculiar efficiency which emerges when English village life confronts the unexpected. Inspector Slack, galvanized by Miss Marple's discovery, began issuing instructions with newfound authority, while Dr. Haydock examined the contents of the enamel jug with the thoroughness of a man who realized he might be called upon to testify in court. Mrs. Mallow stood to one side, her face a study in bewildered indignation. The suggestion that her carefully prepared demonstration had somehow been tampered with clearly affronted her professional pride as much as it alarmed her personal sensibilities. "I can assure you, Inspector," she declared with considerable vigor, "that what I brought to this hall was nothing more dangerous than dried bay leaves from my own shop stock. I've been using the same supplier for 15 years, and I know genuine Laurus nobilis when I see it." She marched to her demonstration table and retrieved her leather satchel, from which she produced another paper packet, identical to the empty one she had shown earlier. "Here, examine these for yourself. You'll find them quite different from whatever abomination has found its way into that jug." Inspector Slack accepted the packet and poured a small quantity of its contents into his palm. The contrast was immediately apparent. These were indeed the proper bay leaves, thin and brittle with the characteristic matte finish of properly dried herbs, broken into irregular fragments that bore no resemblance whatsoever to the glossy, intact leaves floating in the steaming water. Miss Marple approached the demonstration table with the measured steps of someone examining evidence at a museum. Upon the trestle table, arranged with Mrs. Mallow's customary precision, lay the various implements of the herbal demonstration, additional towels, a small oil lamp for backup heating, and several handwritten labels in neat block capitals. "Mrs. Mallow," she inquired with gentle curiosity, "I notice you've prepared labels for your various herbs." "How very thorough of you," the herbalist nodded proudly. "Organization is essential in my line of work, Miss Marple. One cannot afford confusion when dealing with botanical preparations. Each container must be clearly marked to prevent unfortunate mistakes." Miss Marple examined the labels more closely, her eyes drawn to one that read Bay Mallow in the same decisive block lettering that characterized all of Mrs. Mallow's preparations. Yet, as she held it up to the light from the oil lamp, something curious became apparent beneath the ink. "How interesting," she murmured, angling the label to catch the illumination more effectively. "There appears to be something written underneath your label, Mrs. Mallow. In pencil, I believe." Mrs. Mallow frowned and accepted the label for closer inspection. "Why, so there is, though I'm certain I wrote on a clean piece of paper." "How very peculiar." Inspector Slack, drawn by their conversation, peered over Mrs. Mallow's shoulder. With careful effort, they could just make out the ghostly traces of penciled letters beneath the bold ink lettering. The writing was in a different hand entirely, smaller, more precise, and distinctly scholarly in character. "It appears to begin with Lorocera," Miss Marple observed. "And then is that Lorocerasis? Though it seems to have been erased before completion?" "Lorocerasis?" repeated Dr. Haydock, who had been listening to their exchange. "That would be the scientific name for cherry laurel, Prunus lorocerasis." Someone with botanical knowledge began to write the proper Latin designation, then thought better of it. The implications of this discovery hung in the air like incense from the church next door. Someone had prepared a label with the correct scientific terminology for the poisonous plant, then deliberately obscured it and allowed Mrs. Mallow to write her innocent Bay designation over the top. Miss Marple turned her attention to the enamel jug itself, which continued to emit its feeble steam despite the reduced flame of the Primus stove. She circled it slowly, examining it from various angles with the methodical attention of someone accustomed to noticing details that others might overlook. "Inspector," she said presently, "I wonder if you might examine the cork of this jug. Something about it strikes me as rather odd." Slack lifted the jug carefully, noting its weight and the way the steam escaped around the edges of what appeared to be a standard cork stopper. Upon closer examination, however, a small, perfectly round hole became visible in the side of the cork, no larger than a pinprick, but clearly deliberate. "Someone's pushed something through this cork," he announced with growing excitement. "Something thin and sharp, a hat pin perhaps, or a large needle." "But why would anyone do such a thing?" Lady Bantry inquired, though her tone suggested she suspected the answer might be rather more sinister than innocent curiosity. Miss Marple stood quietly for a moment, her hands clasped before her in that characteristic pose she adopted when working through a particularly complex problem. "To release the gas more effectively, I should imagine," she said finally. "Cherry laurel leaves, when heated in water, produce hydrogen cyanide gas. But in a tightly corked container, the gas would have difficulty escaping. A small hole would allow just enough pressure released to create a concentrated stream of poisonous vapor directly beneath the towel tent." The assembled ladies absorbed this explanation with varying degrees of comprehension and horror. Mrs. Clement sank heavily into the nearest chair, while Miss Weatherby began fanning herself vigorously with a church program. "Then this was definitely deliberate," Inspector Slack concluded grimly. "Someone substituted poisonous leaves for Mrs. Mallow's harmless bay leaves, prepared a false label to conceal the switch, and punctured the cork to ensure maximum effectiveness of the poison. It would appear so, Miss Marple agreed, though I confess myself puzzled by certain aspects of the arrangement. The substitution itself was skillfully done, but there are elements that seem almost hurried, as if the perpetrator was working under considerable time pressure. Dr. Haydock, who had been conducting his own examination of the evidence, looked up with a troubled expression. The amount of cherry laurel used was quite substantial, far more than would be necessary for a fatal dose. Someone either wanted to be absolutely certain of the result, or they were uncertain about the proper dosage for their intended effect. Or, Miss Marple suggested quietly, they wished to ensure that the death would appear sudden and dramatic, leaving no doubt about the victim's condition. A smaller dose might have caused illness rather than immediate collapse, potentially allowing time for medical intervention. Inspector Slack closed his notebook with a decisive snap. Right then. This is clearly a case of deliberate murder, and I'll need to interview everyone who was present this evening. Mrs. Mallow, I'll need a complete list of everyone who had access to your demonstration materials and when. As the inspector began organizing his investigation, Miss Marple found herself drawn once again to the demonstration table. Something about the arrangement of items troubled her, not their presence, but their positioning. Everything was almost too perfectly organized, as if someone had taken great care to ensure that nothing appeared out of place. She picked up one of the unused towels, noting its quality and the way it had been folded. These were not the rough cotton towels typically provided by the parish hall for cleaning purposes, but rather good quality linen towels that someone had brought specifically for the demonstration. Mrs. Mallow, she inquired, are these towels from your own supplies? Oh no, Miss Marple. I brought only the herbs and the basic equipment. Mrs. Vale was kind enough to provide the towels. She said she had several at her lodgings that would be perfect for the purpose. Miss Marple examined the towel more closely, running her fingers along its edges and noting the fine quality of the linen. Mrs. Vale had indeed been most thoughtful in her preparations for the evening's demonstration, perhaps more thoughtful than anyone had initially realized. Chapter 5. The Photograph with the Wrong Hat. The evening had grown considerably later than Miss Marple's usual routine would permit, but the gravity of the situation at the parish hall had quite naturally superseded any consideration of domestic schedules. Inspector Slack's preliminary interviews had revealed little beyond the expected expressions of shock and bewilderment, though Miss Marple had noted with interest the various ways in which different people responded to unexpected tragedy. When at last she and Lady Bantry made their way back to the cottage, the familiar comfort of her sitting room seemed almost foreign after the stark realities they had witnessed. Lady Bantry settled herself wearily into her accustomed chair, while Miss Marple busied herself with the ritual of preparing a proper pot of tea, the sovereign remedy for all manner of English disturbances. I simply cannot comprehend it. Jane, Lady Bantry declared, accepting her cup with gratitude. Who could possibly have wanted to harm that poor woman? She seemed perfectly harmless, if rather overeager in her friendliness. Miss Marple arranged herself in her own chair, her knitting forgotten for once as she contemplated the evening's events. That is precisely what troubles me. Dolly, Mrs. Vale's eagerness, as you put it, had a quality that seemed almost rehearsed, as if she were playing a role rather than simply renewing an old acquaintance. You suspected something was amiss from the beginning, didn't you? Not suspected exactly, but there were small discrepancies that troubled me. Do you recall when she mentioned our teacher, Miss Henderson? Lady Bantry frowned, trying to recall the conversation vaguely. What about her? Miss Marple rose and moved to the mahogany secretary that stood against the far wall. From one of its drawers, she withdrew a leather-bound album, its covers worn smooth by decades of handling. This was my mother's parish record book. She was most meticulous about documenting village events and personalities. She opened the album carefully, turning the pages until she found what she sought. Here we are, the parish picnic of 1902. Mother was quite proud of this photograph, as it included nearly every child in the village. Lady Bantry moved to peer over Miss Marple's shoulder. The sepia-toned photograph showed a group of children arranged on the vicarage lawn, their faces solemn with the importance of the occasion. A young Jane Marple stood in the center, wearing a white dress with the blue sash that Mrs. Vale had so accurately remembered. "There I am," Miss Marple said, pointing to her younger self. "And there beside me is indeed Lavinia Hart, the real Lavinia Hart." Lady Bantry studied the photograph intently. The girl standing next to young Jane wore a neat sailor costume topped by a flat straw hat with two distinct ribbon bands encircling the crown. Her serious expression was marred by what appeared to be a small white mark on her chin. "She has a scar," Lady Bantry observed, "just there on her chin. From the vicarage swing, as I recall. Poor Lavinia caught her chin on the rope when she fell. It left quite a distinctive mark." Miss Marple's voice carried a note of sadness. She was a sweet child, though rather delicate. Her aunt in London took her away the following year when her health began to fail. Lady Bantry straightened, comprehension dawning in her eyes. "And Mrs. Vale had no such scar. I would certainly have noticed it. Quite so. But there's more." Miss Marple turned several pages in the album until she located another section devoted to parish records. Here we are, 1903. Lavinia Hart, age 17, died of influenza at her aunt's residence in Reading. Mother was quite particular about recording such things, as the families often requested memorial services, even when the actual burial took place elsewhere. The implication hung between them like a challenge to everything they had witnessed that evening. Lady Bantry sank back into her chair, her teacup rattling slightly in its saucer. Then who was Mrs. Vale, and why did she claim to be Lavinia Hart? Miss Marple closed the album and returned to her seat, her expression thoughtful. "An excellent question, my dear. Someone who had access to remarkably detailed information about village life 50 years ago, yet who made certain small errors that would be apparent only to someone with intimate knowledge of the actual events, such as the teacher's name, among other things. Miss Henderson taught here from 1898 to 1901. By 1902, when Lavinia and I would have been her pupils, Miss Crabtree had taken over the position. It's the sort of mistake someone might make who had heard stories about the old days but hadn't actually lived through them." Lady Bantry set down her cup with a decisive clink. "But Jane, if she wasn't really Lavinia Hart, what was her purpose in coming here? And why would anyone want to kill her for it?" Miss Marple reached for her knitting, finding comfort in the familiar rhythm of her needles as she worked through the puzzle. "I keep returning to those papers she mentioned, the sealed envelope with documents that would set a great wrong right. That suggests some form of blackmail, doesn't it? Someone pretending to be a childhood friend in order to gain access to village secrets, perhaps with the intention of exploiting them for financial gain. But that would mean someone in St. Mary Mead had secrets worth killing to protect. Indeed, it would." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily as she contemplated this possibility. And someone with sufficient knowledge of botany to execute such a cleverly planned substitution. The use of cherry laurel was no accident, Dolly. It required someone who understood the properties of the plant and how to prepare it effectively. Lady Bantry shuddered. To think that such evil could be planned and executed right here in our own village hall, surrounded by all of us. Evil often hides behind the most ordinary facades, Miss Marple observed quietly. The challenge is to look beyond appearances and examine what people actually do, rather than what they claim to be doing. She paused in her knitting to examine a particularly complex stitch. Tomorrow, I believe, will prove quite illuminating. Inspector Slack will no doubt wish to examine Mrs. Vale's belongings more thoroughly, and perhaps we shall learn something more about her true identity and purpose. You have theories already, don't you? Miss Marple smiled, that gentle expression that her friends knew often preceded the unraveling of seemingly impossible mysteries. I have observations. Dear Dolly, the theories will follow when we understand more about the players in this particular drama. Outside, the village clock chimed 11 times, marking the end of what had begun as an ordinary evening and transformed into something far more sinister. Yet in the comfortable sitting room, surrounded by the familiar objects of a lifetime, Miss Marple continued her knitting with unruffled composure, her mind already working through the implications of what they had discovered. Chapter 6. The Florist's Wire. The morning. After the tragedy dawned with that peculiar quality of light that follows significant events, as if the very air had been altered by what had transpired. Miss Marple woke earlier than usual, her mind immediately returning to the puzzle that had occupied her thoughts through the restless hours of the night. After completing her morning routine with customary precision, she decided that a walk to the church would provide both the exercise she required and perhaps some additional insight into the previous evening's events. The churchyard of St. Mary Mead presented its usual picture of peaceful antiquity, the ancient yew trees casting their perpetual shadows across weathered headstones that marked the passage of centuries. Yet this morning, Miss Marple's attention was drawn not to the monuments themselves, but to the hedge that bordered the property, the same hedge from which young Tommy Bale had been cutting laurel the evening before. She found Mrs. Pritchard arranging fresh flowers at the altar, her capable hands working with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed this service for decades. Mrs. Pritchard had been the church's unofficial flower coordinator for as long as anyone could remember, and her arrangements were noted throughout the county for their artistic merit and seasonal appropriateness. "Good morning, Mrs. Pritchard," Miss Marple greeted her with genuine warmth. "How lovely the altar looks. Are those roses from your own garden?" Mrs. Pritchard straightened, a pleased smile crossing her weathered features. "Thank you, Miss Marple. Yes, the roses are mine, though I'm afraid someone has been rather careless with the churchyard plantings. Just look at this laurel hedge, great chunks cut out of it, quite haphazardly." She gestured toward the hedge with evident disapproval. Miss Marple examined the damage with interest, noting that while most of the cuts appeared to be the work of Tommy Bale's pruning shears, there were several smaller sections where the branches had been severed with considerably more precision. "How very odd," Miss Marple observed. "These smaller cuts look almost surgical in their neatness." "Precisely what I thought," Mrs. Pritchard agreed with considerable indignation. "Someone has been using proper florist scissors on my poor hedge. The cuts are far too clean for ordinary garden shears. I suspect it was done sometime yesterday afternoon, as I would certainly have noticed such vandalism during my morning rounds." Miss Marple examined one of the precisely cut branches more closely. The end showed the characteristic clean slice that could only be achieved with very sharp, small scissors, the sort used by professional florists for delicate work rather than the robust pruning shears employed by gardeners. "You keep florist scissors in the vestry, don't you?" Miss Marple inquired with casual interest, among other supplies. "Yes, we maintain a complete kit for flower arranging, scissors, wire, floral foam, and various other necessities, though I do hope no one has been borrowing them without permission." They made their way into the cool interior of the church, their footsteps echoing softly against the stone floor. The vestry, a small chamber behind the altar, served as both storage room and preparation area for the various ceremonial requirements of parish life. Mrs. Pritchard opened a wooden cabinet and withdrew a leather case containing an assortment of florist tools. Everything seems to be in order, she reported, examining the contents methodically, though she paused, frowning slightly. I could have sworn I had a full coil of binding wire yesterday. We use it to secure arrangements and create frameworks for the more elaborate displays. She held up a partially used spool of fine copper wire, the sort employed by florists for invisible support work. There's definitely less here than there should be. Someone has helped themselves to a length of my wire. Miss Marple accepted the spool for closer examination. The wire was of excellent quality, strong enough to provide structural support, yet fine enough to be nearly invisible when properly employed. A missing section might represent several feet of material, certainly enough for whatever purpose the borrower had in mind. When did you last use this wire, Mrs. Pritchard? Tuesday afternoon, when I prepared the arrangements for the Hartwell funeral. I remember coiling the remainder quite carefully, as I always do. Waste not, want not, as my mother used to say. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The Hartwell funeral had taken place on Wednesday, which meant the wire had gone missing sometime between Tuesday evening and the previous day. The timing seemed rather significant given the events that had followed. They returned to the church proper, where Mrs. Pritchard continued her flower arranging, while Miss Marple ostensibly admired the medieval architecture. In reality, her attention was focused on recalling every detail of the previous evening's demonstration, particularly the arrangement of the towel tent over the steaming jug. She had noticed at the time that the towel had been held in place by what appeared to be a simple binding, but she hadn't examined it closely enough to identify the specific type of fastening used. Now, in retrospect, she wondered whether the missing florist's wire might have played a role in securing the improvised steam tent. Mrs. Pritchard, she said presently, you were present at the Women's Institute demonstration last evening, weren't you? Indeed, I was, though I arrived rather late. I had been finishing the funeral wreaths for the Hartwell service, and the work took longer than anticipated. Such a tragic business with poor Mrs. Vale. Did you happen to notice how the towel was secured over the steaming apparatus? Mrs. Pritchard paused in her arranging, her brow furrowed in concentration. Now that you mention it, I did notice something odd about the arrangement. The towel was held remarkably snugly, much more professionally secured than one would expect from a simple herbal demonstration. It reminded me of the way we fasten arrangements here at the church. Miss Marple felt a small thrill of confirmation. In what way specifically? The wire binding, if that's what it was, showed a particular technique, a double twist that we use to ensure permanence in our floral displays. It's not something most people would know how to do properly. The wire must be twisted in a specific direction to achieve maximum hold without cutting through delicate materials. This was precisely the sort of detail that Miss Marple found most illuminating. Technical knowledge of this type suggested someone with considerable experience in flower arranging, experience that went beyond casual familiarity to encompass professional-level skill. And this technique would be familiar to anyone who regularly arranges church flowers? Certainly, though it does require practice to master properly. A novice attempting such a binding would likely either make it too loose to be effective or too tight, potentially damaging whatever material they were trying to secure. Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Pritchard for her time and made her way slowly back toward the village center, her mind working through the implications of what she'd learned. The missing florist's wire, the precisely cut laurel branches, and the professional quality of the towel's securing mechanism all pointed toward someone with both botanical knowledge and considerable skill in flower arranging. Moreover, the timing suggested careful planning rather than spontaneous action. Someone had prepared for the evening's events by acquiring the necessary materials in advance, demonstrating both premeditation and familiarity with the tools required for their deadly purpose. Chapter 7. Labels. Written over, Inspector Slack arrived at Miss Marple's cottage shortly after 10, bearing with him the sealed envelope that had been discovered in Mrs. Vale's handbag. His manner suggested the barely contained excitement of a man who believed he might be on the verge of a significant breakthrough in what was proving to be a most perplexing case. "I thought you might find this interesting, Miss Marple," he announced, settling himself into the chair that Lady Bantry had vacated only minutes before. "The contents are rather illuminating, shall we say." Miss Marple accepted the envelope with appropriate gravity. The address written in neat block letters read simply, "For Miss Marple, when safe." The paper was of good quality, though unremarkable in any distinguishing characteristics that might indicate its source. Inside were several sheets of typing paper, each bearing what purported to be recollections of events from the distant past. The narrative spoke of a wrong baby and a secret removal to an aunt, though the details were vague enough to be either tantalizingly mysterious or deliberately obscure. "Blackmail material, do you think?" Inspector Slack inquired, watching Miss Marple's face for any reaction that might provide insight into the document's significance. "Possibly," Miss Marple replied, though her tone suggested reservations, though if so, it's remarkably nonspecific. "A proper blackmailer would surely provide more concrete details to establish credibility." She examined the typed pages more closely, holding them up to the window light that streamed through her sitting room curtains. The typeface showed certain distinctive characteristics, most notably slightly elevated E's and hyphens that appeared to have been struck with unusual force, creating small indentations in the paper. "Inspector, has anyone in the village been observed using a typewriter recently? This particular machine has some rather distinctive quirks that might make it identifiable." Slack consulted his notebook with the methodical precision of a man determined to overlook no detail. "As a matter of fact, yes. There's a gentleman staying at the Blue Boar, Mr. Felix Arden. Says he's a writer collecting material for a book about village customs and traditions. He's been seen with a portable typewriter on several occasions." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose with interest. "How fortuitous." "And has this Mr. Arden been in the village long?" "About a fortnight, according to Mrs. Jameson at the inn. Keeps rather to himself, though he's been asking a good many questions about local history. Apparently he's particularly interested in old parish records and family histories. The implications of this information settled over Miss Marple like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle finding their natural positions. Writer researching village history would have access to precisely the sort of detailed information that Mrs. Vale had demonstrated about past events and personalities. I believe, Miss Marple," she said thoughtfully, "that a conversation with Mr. Arden might prove most enlightening. But first, there's something else I'd like to examine." She led Inspector Slack to her secretary desk and withdrew the magnifying glass that she kept for examining fine needlework. Returning to the typed documents, she studied them with renewed attention to detail. "Look here, Inspector. Do you notice anything particular about the spacing and alignment of these lines?" Slack peered over her shoulder, frowning at the typewritten text. "They seem neat enough, professional-looking, I'd say." "Indeed, but observe the margins and the way certain letters are positioned. This was typed by someone with considerable experience, possibly someone who earns their living by writing. The spacing is too precise, the margins too exact for casual correspondence." She set down the magnifying glass and moved to the window, gazing out at the village street where normal life continued its placid course. "I'm beginning to suspect that Mrs. Vale's appearance in St. Mary Mead was not the spontaneous reunion she claimed it to be. Someone with access to detailed village history provided her with the information she used to establish her false identity." "You think this Arden fellow was working with her?" "It's certainly a possibility worth exploring, though I confess myself puzzled by certain aspects of the scheme. If Mr. Arden possessed such detailed knowledge of village affairs, why did Mrs. Vale make the error about Miss Henderson? It suggests either incomplete information or imperfect communication between conspirators. Inspector Slack made another note, his expression growing grimmer as the implications became clear. A falling out between partners, perhaps. These criminal partnerships rarely end well. Miss Marple returned to her chair and resumed her examination of the typewritten pages. Something about them continued to trouble her beyond their obvious purpose as potential blackmail material. The very precision of the typing seemed almost too careful, as if the author had been particularly concerned with creating an impression of authenticity. Inspector, you mentioned that Mr. Arden has been asking questions about parish records. Has he shown particular interest in any specific families or time periods? Slack consulted his notes once more. According to Mrs. Trent, he's been most curious about events around the turn of the century. Births, deaths, marriages, that sort of thing. Particularly interested in any irregularities or unusual circumstances surrounding such events. How very thorough of him. And I suppose he would have encountered the name Lavinia Hart in his researches. Quite possibly. The parish records from that period are fairly complete, I'm told. Miss Marple set the documents aside and reached for her knitting, finding that the familiar rhythm of her needles helped organize her thoughts. The pattern that was emerging suggested a carefully planned deception, though one with several puzzling elements that didn't quite fit the obvious explanation. I wonder, she mused aloud, whether Mr. Arden might be persuaded to show us some examples of his writing, for comparison purposes, you understand? I could certainly request to see his work, Slack agreed. Though if he's involved in this business, he's hardly likely to cooperate willingly. On the contrary, Inspector, if Mr. Arden is guilty of conspiracy in this matter, he will be most eager to appear cooperative and helpful. It's the innocent who often prove reluctant to submit to official scrutiny, while the guilty frequently overcompensate with excessive willingness to assist. This observation, delivered with Miss Marple's characteristic gentleness, carried the weight of considerable experience in matters of human nature. Inspector Slack had learned to pay attention when Miss Marple made pronouncements about human behavior, as they were invariably based on careful observation rather than mere speculation. Right then, he declared, rising from his chair with renewed determination. I'll pay a call on Mr. Arden this afternoon to see what he has to say about typewriters and village history. An excellent plan, Miss Marple agreed. Though I suspect you may find him most forthcoming about his literary pursuits. Perhaps rather more forthcoming than the circumstances would normally warrant. Chapter 8. The Gardener's Trug. The afternoon brought with it that peculiar restlessness that often follows significant revelations, and Miss Marple found herself drawn once again toward the scene of the previous evening's tragedy. The parish hall stood empty now, its doors sealed pending Inspector Slack's complete investigation, but the churchyard beside it continued its ancient function as both sanctuary and meeting ground for the living community. She encountered Beale, the church gardener, tending to the borders near the lych gate, with the methodical attention of a man who had spent decades coaxing beauty from the English soil. His weathered hands moved among the plants with the confidence of long familiarity, deadheading roses and adjusting stakes with economical precision. "Good afternoon, Beale," Miss Marple greeted him warmly. "The gardens are looking particularly fine this season." He straightened with evident pleasure at the compliment. He was a man of perhaps 60 years, bent by honest labor, but possessed of that quiet dignity that comes from a lifetime of useful work. "Thank you kindly. Miss Marple, though I must say yesterday's business has left me quite unsettled." Terrible thing to happen at a church gathering. Indeed it was. I understand you were working in the churchyard yesterday evening when we were all at the demonstration. That I was. Had been meaning to tackle that laurel hedge for weeks. It was growing something fierce around the old Hartwell monument. Got a good start on it before the light failed. He gestured toward the hedge where the evidence of his pruning was clearly visible in the neat, workmanlike cuts that contrasted sharply with the smaller, more precise incisions Miss Marple had noted earlier. "You use a trug for collecting the cuttings, don't you?" she inquired with the casual interest of someone making pleasant conversation. "Always have done." "Proper wicker trug that belonged to my father before me. Left it by the gate when I finished, as I always do. Mrs. Beale collects the cuttings in the morning for the compost heap." His expression grew troubled, though she mentioned this morning that someone had been helping themselves to the laurel. "Found several good sprigs missing when she came to empty the trug." Miss Marple's pulse quickened, though she maintained her placid exterior. "Missing, you say? How curious. And it wasn't the first time yesterday evening, either. I distinctly remember leaving the trug nearly full at 6. Always check the church clock before heading home for my supper. But when I passed by again around 7, taking a shortcut from the Blue Boar, I noticed it wasn't quite so full as it had been." This information struck Miss Marple as highly significant. The timing placed the theft of the laurel sprigs at precisely the period when the Women's Institute ladies would have been gathering for their demonstration, providing an ideal opportunity for someone to acquire the poisonous leaves without attracting attention. "Did you happen to notice anyone near the trug during that time?" she asked, striving to keep her tone merely curious rather than interrogatory. Beale scratched his grizzled chin thoughtfully. "Well, now let me think. There was Mrs. Pritchard, of course. She passed by with her flower-arranging bag around 6:45 to 7. Always nods politely, does Mrs. Pritchard, though she seemed rather preoccupied yesterday evening. Anyone else?" "That writer fellow from the Blue Boar came by with his camera taking pictures of the old gravestones for his book. Seemed most interested in the inscriptions on the 18th century monuments. Pleasant enough gentleman, though he did ask rather a lot of questions about the various plants we grow here." Miss Marple felt another piece of the puzzle settling into place. Questions about the plants. Indeed, particularly interested in which ones might be considered dangerous if not handled properly. Said he was writing a chapter about traditional remedies and wanted to be accurate about the risks. I told him about the yew-berries, of course, and mentioned that the laurel should never be used for cooking. Unlike proper bay leaves, the significance of this exchange was not lost on Miss Marple. Mr. Arden had been systematically gathering information about poisonous plants under the guise of research for his book, knowledge that would be essential for anyone planning the sort of substitution that had proved fatal to Mrs. Vale. And was there anyone else about? Bill nodded slowly. Mrs. Vale herself came by, actually had a little reticule with her, and was carrying a hat pin, one of those long ones the ladies use for securing their hats. Said she was taking an evening stroll before the demonstration, and complimented me on the tidiness of the churchyard. Miss Marple's interest sharpened considerably. A hat pin would be precisely the right implement for creating the small hole they had discovered in the cork of the enamel jug. The fact that Mrs. Vale had been carrying such an item suggested either remarkable coincidence or careful preparation. Did she linger near the trug at all? Now that you mention it, yes. She seemed quite interested in the laurel cuttings, asking whether they were the same as bay leaves. I explained the difference, of course. Told her how dangerous cherry laurel could be if someone mistook it for culinary herbs. She seemed most attentive to the information. This revelation presented Miss Marple with a fascinating contradiction. If Mrs. Vale had been the intended victim of someone else's plotting, why had she been gathering information about the very poison that would later kill her? Unless, perhaps, she had not been a victim at all, but rather a participant in some scheme that had gone tragically wrong. Beale, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. After Mrs. Vale left, did you notice whether the trug appeared any different? The old gardener's eyes sharpened with the attention of someone whose livelihood depended on noticing small changes in his domain. Funny you should ask that, Miss Marple. I did think it looked a bit disturbed when I passed by later, almost as if someone had been picking through the cuttings, selecting particular pieces. They walked together toward the gate, where the trug had been positioned the previous evening. The spot was marked now only by a slight depression in the grass, but Beale indicated the exact placement with the precision of long habit. Always put it just here, where Mrs. Beale can find it easily in the morning. Yesterday it was nearly full with fresh laurel, the glossy kind with the serrated edges that grow so thick around the monuments. Miss Marple examined the ground carefully, though she hardly expected to find physical evidence after so much time had passed. Still, the positioning was significant, as it would have provided easy access to anyone approaching from either the village street or the church itself. "I don't suppose," she said delicately, "that you happened to notice Mrs. Vale's reticule when she departed, whether it appeared any fuller than when she arrived." Vale's weathered features creased in concentration. "Well, now I can't say for certain about the size, but I do recall thinking it seemed to be bulging a bit more than when she first approached, though ladies' handbags are mysterious things to an old gardener like myself." As they parted company, Miss Marple found herself facing a puzzle that grew more complex with each new piece of information. The evidence suggested that Mrs. Vale had acquired laurel cuttings from the trug, yet she had also died from inhaling the fumes of those same leaves. Either she had been the victim of her own plotting, or someone had used her preparations against her in a particularly cruel twist of fate. The afternoon shadows were lengthening as Miss Marple made her way slowly back toward her cottage, her mind working through the various possibilities presented by Beale's testimony. One thing seemed increasingly certain. The events of the previous evening had been far more carefully orchestrated than they had initially appeared, and the truth behind Mrs. Vale's death was likely to prove more complex than anyone had yet imagined. Chapter 9. A name. That wasn't hers. Evening approached with a golden quality peculiar to English summer twilight, though Miss Marple found little peace in its familiar beauty. The accumulated weight of the day's discoveries pressed upon her mind with increasing urgency, suggesting patterns that were both troubling and illuminating. She had requested that Inspector Slack meet her at the vicarage, where certain parish records might provide the final pieces of a puzzle that was proving more intricate than anyone had initially suspected. The Reverend Clement received them in his study with the grave courtesy of a man accustomed to being consulted in matters of both spiritual and temporal significance. His desk bore the comfortable clutter of scholarly pursuits, sermon notes, correspondence, and several leather-bound volumes that recorded the formal ceremonies of parish life spanning many decades. "I understand you wish to consult our baptismal and marriage registers," he said, settling his spectacles more firmly upon his nose. "Naturally, you're welcome to examine any records that might assist in this tragic investigation." Miss Marple accepted the heavy volume he offered with appropriate reverence for its historical significance. The marriage register for the year 1903 lay open before them, its pages filled with the careful copperplate handwriting that characterized official documents of the era. She turned the pages methodically, searching for a particular entry that she hoped would confirm her growing suspicions. "Here we are," she announced presently, her finger indicating a specific line in the registry. "The marriage of Thomas Weatherby to Miss Margaret Hartwell, performed on September the 15th, 1903, and note here in the margin the record of bridesmaids in attendance." Inspector Slack leaned closer to examine the faded ink. Among the names listed in the precise hand of the then-vicar was that of Miss Lavinia Hart, with a small notation beside it indicating her status as a distant cousin of the bride. But look here, Miss Marple continued, turning to a section of the register devoted to subsequent annotations and corrections. A note added later in different ink. Hart, unable to attend due to removal to Reading for reasons of health, died January 1904, influenza. Notification received from Mrs. Agnes Thornby, guardian. The implications of this discovery settled over the small group like morning mist. The real Lavinia Hart had not only died young, as Miss Marple's mother's records had indicated, but had died before she could fulfill her obligations as a bridesmaid, well before the supposed reunion, with her childhood friend that had brought Mrs. Vale to St. Mary Mead. Then our Mrs. Vale was definitely an imposter, Inspector Slack concluded with satisfaction. But who was she really, and what was her true purpose here? Miss Marple closed the register thoughtfully. I believe, Inspector, that we may find some answers to that question by examining the connections between our various players more carefully. Consider, for instance, the curious coincidence that both Mr. Arden and Mrs. Vale appeared in our village at approximately the same time. You think they were working together? Initially, yes, but I suspect their partnership may have soured rather dramatically. She paused, gathering her thoughts. Mrs. Vale came here with information that could only have been provided by someone with access to detailed parish records and village gossip. Mr. Arden, with his researches into local history, would have been ideally positioned to supply such intelligence. The Reverend Clement nodded slowly. I recall now that Mr. Arden spent considerable time examining our older records just last week. He claimed to be particularly interested in family, histories and unusual circumstances surrounding births and deaths in the early part of the century. Exactly the sort of information that would enable someone to construct a plausible false identity, Miss Marple observed. But consider this. If Mr. Arden and Mrs. Vale were partners in some blackmail scheme, what caused their association to end so violently? Inspector Slack consulted his notebook with renewed interest. Perhaps she tried to cheat him out of his share, or maybe she discovered something that made her dangerous to him. Both possibilities, Miss Marple agreed, though I suspect the truth may be rather more complex. You see, there's something that has been troubling me about Mrs. Vale's behavior yesterday evening. Her eagerness to participate in the steam treatment, her insistence on going first. It suggests either remarkable foolhardiness or what, Miss Marple? Or complete confidence that the treatment was harmless. What if Mrs. Vale believed she was perfectly safe because she thought she controlled all the variables in the situation? This observation prompted a lengthy silence. As both men worked through its implications, the idea that Mrs. Vale might have been the architect of her own destruction added a new dimension to an already complex puzzle. Are you suggesting she prepared the poisonous steam herself? Inspector Slack asked incredulously. Not for herself, certainly, but perhaps for someone else. Someone she believed deserved such a fate. Consider the positioning of events. Mrs. Vale arrives with her mysterious papers and her claims about setting wrongs right. She demonstrates remarkable knowledge of village secrets, suggesting access to information that might be damaging to certain residents. She then orchestrates a situation where she can gather the local ladies together under circumstances that would allow her to eliminate someone she perceived as a threat to her plans. Miss Marple rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the peaceful churchyard where so much of the previous day's drama had unfolded. But someone anticipated her intentions and turned her own weapon against her. The question is, who possessed both the knowledge and the opportunity to effect such a reversal? Someone who understood her plan in advance, Inspector Slack mused. Someone she trusted enough to reveal her intentions precisely, and someone with sufficient botanical knowledge to understand the properties of cherry laurel, along with the technical skill to prepare it effectively. Miss Marple turned back to face her companions. I believe we must look for someone who had access to Mrs. Vale's preparations, who possessed the necessary expertise with plants and flowers, and who had compelling reasons to prevent whatever revelation she was planning to make. The Reverend Clement cleared his throat delicately. Miss Marple, are you suggesting that someone in our own congregation might be capable of such calculating violence? I'm afraid, Vicar, that human nature is much the same in St. Mary Mead as anywhere else. People will go to extraordinary lengths to protect what they hold dear: reputations, families, their position in society. Mrs. Vale represented a threat to someone's carefully constructed life, and that someone took correspondingly drastic measures to eliminate the danger. Inspector Slack made several notes, his expression growing grimmer as the scope of the conspiracy became apparent. Right then. We need to identify everyone who had advanced knowledge of the demonstration, access to the necessary materials and skills in flower arranging or herbal preparation. A relatively small group, I should think. Though, I suspect our murderer is someone who has been hiding in plain sight, protected by the very ordinariness of their daily activities and the respect accorded to their position in village society, as they prepared to leave the vicarage. Miss Marple paused at the door. Inspector, I believe tomorrow will bring us to the resolution of this matter. The evidence is all present. It merely requires the proper arrangement to reveal the pattern that has been there all along. The confidence in her voice carried the weight of considerable experience in matters of human deception, leaving both men with the distinct impression that the mystery of Mrs. Vale's death would soon be laid bare in all its tragic complexity. Chapter 10. Parish Hall leaves and names the following. Morning brought with it that sense of resolution that accompanies the final movements of a well-conducted symphony. Miss Marple had requested that Inspector Slack gather the principal participants in the previous evening's tragedy at the parish hall, ostensibly for the purpose of completing his investigation, though she harbored more definitive intentions regarding the outcome of their meeting. The hall itself seemed smaller in daylight, its mundane character somehow at odds with the dramatic events it had recently witnessed. The demonstration table remained as they had left it, though the enamel jug and its deadly contents had been removed for official examination. Mrs. Mallow sat rigidly upright, her professional reputation clearly weighing heavily upon her conscience. Despite her obvious innocence in the matter, Mr. Felix Arden occupied a chair near the window, his portable typewriter case resting beside him, with a casual confidence of a man who believed himself beyond suspicion. Mrs. Pritchard had positioned herself near the vestry door, her hands folded with the composed dignity of someone accustomed to public responsibility. Lady Bantry had claimed a seat in the front row, her expression combining curiosity with the satisfaction of someone who anticipated witnessing the triumph of justice over deception. Miss Marple rose from her chair with the deliberate grace that characterized all her movements, her knitting bag clutched in one hand and her mother's parish record book in the other. She surveyed the assembled group with that mild expression that her friends had learned to recognize as the prelude to revelations of considerable significance. Have asked Inspector Slack to gather us here this morning, she began in her gentle voice, because I believe we owe it to the memory of the woman who died in this very spot to understand exactly what transpired and why. More importantly, we must ensure that justice is served for what was, I am now convinced, a most carefully planned murder. A murmur ran through the small assembly, though whether of surprise or apprehension was difficult to determine. Mr. Arden shifted uncomfortably in his seat, while Mrs. Pritchard's composed expression never wavered. The woman who called herself Mrs. Isabel Vale was indeed an impostor, Miss Marple continued, opening her mother's record book to the relevant page. The real Lavinia Hart died of influenza in Reading in January 1904 at the age of 17. Our visitor had assumed a false identity for purposes that became clear only through careful examination of the evidence she left behind. She gestured toward Inspector Slack, who produced the sealed envelope containing the typed documents. These papers speak of family secrets and wrong babies, the sort of vague accusations that might serve as the foundation for a blackmail scheme. The typing, we have determined, was done on Mr. Arden's portable machine, identifiable by its distinctive elevated ease and forcefully struck hyphens. Mr. Arden half rose from his chair, his face flushed with indignation. I protest most strongly against any implication that I was involved in. Please sit down. Mr. Arden, Miss Marple said with quiet authority, your involvement is beyond question, though your precise role requires some clarification. You provided Mrs. Vale with the historical information necessary for her impersonation, gleaned from your researches in our parish records. You also furnished her with knowledge about the poisonous properties of cherry laurel, information that she intended to use for her own murderous purposes. The admission hung in the morning air like smoke from an extinguished candle. Lady Bantry leaned forward with intense interest, while Mrs. Mallow's face registered growing comprehension. You see, Miss Marple explained, Mrs. Vale did not come to St. Mary Mead as a victim, but as a would-be murderer. She had identified someone in our community whom she believed possessed secrets worth exploiting, and she planned to eliminate that person while appearing to be nothing more than a harmless, nostalgic visitor. The bay leaf demonstration provided her with the perfect opportunity, an apparently innocent gathering, where she could substitute poisonous cherry, laurel for harmless herbs. Miss Marple moved to the demonstration table, her movements precise and deliberate. She collected the necessary laurel from Beale's trug, using the hat pin she carried to prepare the cork with its telltale puncture. She brought her own towels to ensure proper control over the arrangement, and she insisted on participating first in the demonstration to establish her apparent innocence. But something went wrong, Inspector Slack interjected, following Miss Marple's reasoning with growing understanding. Indeed it did. Someone anticipated her plan and turned her own preparations against her. The question was, who possessed both the knowledge of her intentions and the skill necessary to effect such a reversal? Miss Marple's gaze settled upon Mrs. Pritchard, whose composed demeanor had not altered throughout the recitation. The answer lies in understanding what Mrs. Vale's mysterious papers were really about. The reference to a wrong baby and events from 1902 pointed toward a specific family scandal that occurred during the summer of that year. She opened the parish register to a page marked with a ribbon. Ruth Pritchard's maiden name was Hartwell. Her mother, Margaret Hartwell, bore a child out of wedlock in the summer of 1902, a child that was quietly removed from the family and placed with relatives to preserve reputations. Ruth's entire life has been built upon the foundation of respectability that followed the careful concealment of that irregular birth. Mrs. Pritchard's hands tightened almost imperceptibly, though her expression remained unchanged. Mrs. Vale, through Mr. Arden's research, had discovered this family secret and intended to use it for financial gain. But Ruth recognized the threat for what it was and took decisive action to protect everything she held dear. Miss Marple lifted one of the towels from the demonstration table, examining its edges with careful attention. The securing of this towel showed the distinctive double twist technique that Mrs. Pritchard uses in her church flower arrangements. She had access to florist's wire from the vestry, knowledge of plant properties through her gardening work, and the opportunity to switch the jug contents while appearing to help with the demonstration setup. She plucked fresh laurel sprigs from the churchyard hedge, the precise cuts that were noted among Bale's cruder pruning. She substituted these for Mrs. Mallow's harmless bay leaves, knowing that Mrs. Vale would insist on going first and would thus fall victim to her own intended weapon. Mrs. Pritchard rose slowly from her chair, her dignity intact despite the weight of accusation. "The village can forgive many things," she said quietly, "but not the truth spoken by the wrong mouth. I thought merely to frighten her. Laurel water is used medically in tiny amounts. I didn't fully understand how concentrated the fumes would become under the towel. The confession carried the weight of genuine remorse, though it could not alter the fact of deliberate intent." Inspector Slack moved forward with his handcuffs, his manner respectful but resolute. "Mrs. Pritchard," Miss Marple said gently, "I understand the desperation that drove you to such measures, but taking a life, even in defense of one's reputation, cannot be justified." As they led Mrs. Pritchard away, the parish hall fell into contemplative silence. Lady Bantry moved to stand beside Miss Marple, her voice subdued when she finally spoke. "It seems dreadful to have one's past fetched back and used as a weapon, Miss." Marple folded her knitting with characteristic precision. "The past is indeed a powerful thing, Dolly, useful for remembering the good, but dangerous when it becomes a tool for threatening the innocent. One must examine both leaves and names with equal care, for both can be other than they appear."